welcome back to the Heartland Leadership Podcast, a podcast all about leadership and the way of Jesus. My name's Clinton.
My name's Mike.
Drew Steinhart here.
Brian Alonzo.
And today we want to have a conversation about digital discipleship. What does that mean, you guys? You guys have been floating this term around in our staff meetings, and obviously there's in-person discipleship. We see that happen throughout Scripture. Presumably we've been doing that for years at Heartland, but now digital discipleship. What does that mean?
Yeah, I can speak to it if you guys want. Yeah, I think one of the things for us as a church and even as a staff, like we want to make sure we're keeping discipleship and the way that we go about discipling people and being disciples that make disciples at the forefront of what we do and who we are as a church and as individuals. Mm-hmm. But in this time right now, like you just alluded to, we can't do the face-to-face interaction, discipleship as we know it. So what does it look like to disciple somebody when you're not having a face-to-face conversation like we are now, but having to look at them through a screen? Like, can discipleship occur that way? Does discipleship occur that way? And so we've just been having some conversations around it, and that term of digital discipleship's not like an original term that we coined.
Right.
For sure stolen like a whole bunch of other things, we've done, but it seems to be a term that we're utilizing and embracing, especially, in this time.
Well, Drew, we might have some viewers that have maybe not heard that word, discipleship.
Yeah.
Kind of an old, weird word. Can you help us out? What does that mean?
Yeah, so when we're talking discipleship, we're talking apprenticeship to Jesus.
Apprenticeship.
Yeah,
Okay.
so one of the phrases, certainly this is how Dave puts it, and I might get it slightly wrong, but what it would look like if Jesus was walking in your shoes, living your life. And so I guess to make that word discipleship, which sometimes can feel really nebulous, what is that?
Yeah.
We're really talking about being a lifelong learner of Jesus, an apprentice of Jesus. And that's kind of an ongoing journey in all of our lives where we're never going to arrive. We're never going to reach a point of, okay, checkbox, I've mastered discipleship. And also, I guess the other piece to keep in mind when we talk about discipleship is that some churches or some places discipleship is complete this coursework, complete this set of classes, read the Bible this many times, do this many things. But really when we talk about discipleship here at Heartland, we're talking about something that's taking place at all times. I mean, even as you are perhaps tuning in to interact with some content or some media that is not as helpful in forming you to look like Jesus, you are being discipled. You are actually being discipled in a way that deforms your character and could lead to you looking less like Jesus. So digital discipleship, we're talking about this taking place over different means digitally, but also I would say specifically in this time period right now, working through the COVID-19 pandemic, there may be some different ways that we have more commonality perhaps than normal, that these are the pieces of our apprenticeship to Jesus where we're all kind of having to engage or be formed in those ways right now.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that like the whole digital side of things, like the heart and the intent behind the discipleship, I think stays the same. Mm-hmm. Like it's still all there. But when you're having to switch platforms now, I can't get together with people for coffee, or I can't, just have people come over to our home and like spend time with them. Like it presents new challenges, but at the same time, there's also new opportunities. I feel like there's ways for us to be creative and engage with people where they're at, and that's one of the opportunities. It's easier, I think, sometimes to enter into someone's world because you don't have to take that step of leaving your home. People don't have to okay, let me schedule this. It's much easier for them to pop on a phone call, respond to a text message, or even jump on a video call. So it's been a weird dynamic that I've seen play out.
And I would say like one of the things that I think we're seeing is the mission for us as the church and as followers and as disciples of Jesus hasn't changed, but the method has. So that mission coming out of the Great Commission to go and be disciples, that make disciples, like that hasn't changed. But the method right now that we're experiencing in this pandemic time is certainly changing. And so what does that look like for us to apprentice people, to include people, to imitate us as we imitate Jesus, that call that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians, how do we go about that in these different mediums, and what are those opportunities, but what are also some of those difficulties that we're facing?
And I guess the question about difficulties kind of reverts back to, well, there must have been some benefit, some good thing that comes from actually meeting in person, face to face. What are we missing during these past, 6 or 8 weeks about that in-person discipleship? Is there something special about that, or?
I miss hugs. You guys miss hugs?
I don't.
No, you don't miss hugs.
Touch is not your personal.
Maybe it's just me. I don't know.
That's not your love language.
I want to hug you guys right now.
I think for me, one of the things that I do miss is, I guess I have no feelings about the hug component, but one of the things I do miss is I think there's a way that we can sometimes miss tone and intent and inflection when we're not face to face. So for example, got a really great email for giving some feedback to something I did recently, and it was not critical, but it definitely had some constructive elements of, did you think about this, or perhaps this was missing. Face to face, I'm going to get a really good sense with this individual. Are they upset? Are they angry? Are they, really positive? When things are limited even to a video call, there's a little, I think, easier way of kind of hiding perhaps some of that, bringing my whole real self and emotions to the table. And that impacts, at least for me sometimes, how do I respond here? How compassionate, how gentle might I need to be? Or is this something where they're inviting me right in and saying, speak into this? You don't have to qualify yourself. So I miss some of that.
Yeah. What's interesting with that, I've seen two sides of it. So there is that side where people will be a little more guarded. They'll be a little more polished. It's that whole Instagram filter lifestyle thing where they're showing you just bits and pieces of what the good stuff is. But I've also seen a difference between the digital format. So if we're doing video calls, people will be more refined. On a Sunday morning when we do our online church thing and we have the chat going, when it's just chat, I feel like there's a barrier that's been lifted and people are a lot more real and raw and open and honest. It's almost, I grew up Catholic, and so there's that element of the confessional. It's almost like that. Like people enter into this thing where they feel like, I have permission and space here to kind of let my guard down. Where on a Sunday morning here in the lobby, when you say, how you doing? It's, oh, I'm good. Whereas Sunday morning online church, how are you doing? And it's like, blah. They just kind of vomit everything that's been going on. And so it's just interesting in both those formats how that plays out.
Well, and in particular, I think on our chat, for our church specifically, you don't have to identify who you are. So you can make a username, and then that anonymity can really let the floodgates loose for stuff you want to.
Which we may have to filter in the future, but right now that's how it is. Well, I would say one of the things I feel like is missing at Heartland, we talk about the discipleship triangle. So the REI component being relationships, experiences, and information, all three kind of happening and functioning together. In a discipling relationship, so you have this time that discipling relationship is based, and the foundational piece is based in relationship that you have with one another, with that group of people. And in that, it's not just about, hey, let's open up the Bible or ask the 2 discipleship questions. There certainly is an information component to it, but I would hope in that discipleship and in that invitation with those people that you're apprenticing, you're having these experiences together. You're experiencing how God is at work and how His Spirit is moving, and sharing the love of Jesus, with other people, whatever that might look like. And I think that if we're using that discipleship triangle, I think in the kind of digital discipleship age that we're in, or method that we're utilizing right now, I think the relationships are there and are still there. It may look a little different. I think the information piece is there, but I think one of the things we are missing that we're trying to figure out maybe is, what are those experiences that we're getting to share in together in those discipling relationships? So that's just one of the things that's kind of interesting to me.
I think one other little caveat of the relational piece that it's a little hard to simulate digitally is, and this is maybe going to sound a little negative, but I really don't mean it to, is when you gather on Sunday morning here, at one of our Heartland campuses, there may be someone else in the room who you actually struggle to get along with. Maybe there's a run-in you had in the past, or your kids had an issue with each other, or maybe even in business you had a dealing and it just came off feeling a little sour. And I think a big part of our discipleship is we learn to love each other in this radical way that pushes us to say, no, the good news about Jesus would call me to love this person. And to some degree, being at home, we don't get as many of those opportunities with those individuals. But I think the thing we have to be careful about, and maybe the way we can redirect some of that focus, is a lot of people I know can relate right now to the experience of working from home. And so they never have quite experienced before for many of us, there's little Joey or little Jill running in and interrupting mom or dad while they're working. And so in this new setup, like, that becomes a practical question that I think a lot of people can relate to. How are you responding with grace and love as you're interrupted by your kids as you're trying to do work? And so almost looking for those opportunities where that call is still there to be loving when I'm not gathering with individuals who, I wouldn't spend time with otherwise.
Muting the audio and the video for sure helps with that. That option is for sure helpful.
That's a good point. I hadn't actually thought about that, how engaging so much digitally with peers and friends and the pressures of that, like, okay, kids, be quiet right now, daddy's on a call, like that does directly impact the discipleship methods that I'm using on my kids, right? Because their norm is completely different now as well. I'm not hopping on a Zoom call with them, but they're seeing a different side of dad. They're seeing work dad sometimes, and that's a good point. I hadn't even thought about how that, from their perspective, like how that could change things. Yeah.
So I think this dovetails nicely into this idea that we use around Heartland. Sometimes it's not originated with us, but discipleship spaces. We've been talking about how there's some unique spaces, like we're in our house, or how is that different from meeting publicly on a Sunday morning? Mike, you're pretty well versed in these spaces. Can we just kind of dive into that, articulate that, and help us understand maybe how that rubric of spaces can help us navigate the online world we find ourselves in?
Yeah. Please cut me off and interrupt me, because I could just start talking and go on for this for a while.
Well, just briefly, each of the spaces.
So, just like Clint mentioned, definitely not a Heartland original thought or idea, again, stolen. But Alex Absalom, another guy named Bobby Harrington have innovated a lot of these spaces, conversations when it comes to discipleship and what that looks like in church world. The idea of the spaces originated from Edward T. Hall, who did some sociological studies on how people naturally function in these different social settings that they find themselves in. I think it's called proxemics. I don't know.
Proximity to each other.
Yeah, and proximity to one another. Mm-hmm. So essentially there's four spaces. There's a public space that everyone kind of functions in, and that's a space generally around 100 plus people. Usually you're gathered around a shared experience or event that's occurring, and in that space, you're not having a whole lot of interaction with the person sitting beside you. So think of a sporting event that you go to.
Or here when we were gathering in person.
Yeah, church world's probably a little bit different, but generally, church world probably breaks a lot of the social norms in some ways. But yeah, if you're at a sporting event, the person I'm sitting next to at a Cavs game, for example, I'm not looking at him and saying, hey, you know what? I really struggle with ABCXYZ.
Right.
Everyone just knows that's not socially normal or acceptable and would just feel so weird.
And one way to look at it is you're sometimes in that public space interacting with almost an external resource or object. So at the Cavs game, the Cavs don't really care about the 30,000 people watching at home on TV. The game is the thing. And so likewise, I think to your point about the church, some pastors, very interactive. I'm talking. Other pastors, it wouldn't matter if there was a congregation in the room or not. It is going to be the exact same presentation. So I think that helps sometimes imagining what that public is like.
Yeah, and then so you have the public space, 100 plus people. Maybe you talk, maybe you don't. If you do interact with somebody, it's usually around that event or experience that you're sharing. Wow, that play was awesome, whatever it may be. And then there's the social space setting, which, depending on numbers, typically around gathering of people around 20 to 70 people. So I kind of equate that to a backyard cookout, a barbecue you're having with a bunch of your neighbors. So some of them you know well, some of them you don't know well. And usually in this space, in this setting, you're sharing snapshots of your life. I might tell you, been married for 10 years, pastor at a church, have 2 kids, things like that, little snapshots. Again, in that setting, if I was to look at you in that space in the backyard, say, hey, just need to tell you, I know we just met, but I really struggle with this. Here's some of my deep, dark secrets. Just super weird, not socially. Again, it's that snapshot kind of space.
Would the lobby outside of the worship center count as a social space?
Yeah, I would see that very much as a social space and how people kind of function there. Asking how are you doing sort of thing. There are some pockets, again, church world kind of breaks some of those spaces and social norms.
And the idea is that each size of gathering or area has a different set of social norms around them and like the appropriate kind of behavior.
Yeah.
And I think it's even like an attention thing. So in the public, you're watching the Cavs game. That's where your attention's going. I can only give Mike a tiny bit of attention. Even in the backyard barbecue, I can give him a little more attention, but maybe my kids are running around and I don't want them to get into trouble. And I'm also watching the grill. And so as you see that space get smaller, there's this corresponding, I should be able to focus on Mike a little bit.
Okay, so there's public of 100 plus, social 20 to 70.
Yeah,
Then
75. And then the personal space, which would be where hopefully Drew would give me some of his attention. Okay. Finally, Drew would be giving me some of his attention. But that's the space of typically like a 6 to 12. And this is where, I mean, it's kind of labeled as personal space, but truly where you share more personal thoughts and feelings. So I kind of equate this as me having a group of, my close friends over on a summer night in the back deck having a cigar or something like that. And yeah, in that space.
Have you been doing that since the quarantine?
I have not.
Okay.
But I cannot wait to dive into that. Yeah.
It's been snowing as well.
And do some personal.
The cigar shop
time
is not
on
one of
back.
the essential services?
I don't believe it is,
Okay.
but online ordering still is. So
Gotcha.
just saying.
Let the reader understand.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that personal space setting, like that would be a space, like we're hanging out on my back deck, us right here, where I might share, hey guys, here's some stuff I've been struggling, here's some things going on in the marriage, like would love your thoughts, would love kind of your input, or just to let you guys into that space a little bit more. That would be much more of a normal kind of space. So in church world, you think of like your small group type of setting.
Is there a force space that gets even smaller?
There is the fourth space, so that
Okay.
would be the intimate or the transparent space, and that's like 1 or 2 people in your life. So you think of like maybe a best friend. That these are the people typically in your life that know the good, the bad, everything about you.
That wouldn't be the case in the personal?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Not necessarily. There might be some people that you find yourself in that personal space with that would be in that transparent or intimate space, but typically not. Like even in the personal space, I might let you in on some more personal things than I would in a social space setting, but I'm still probably not going to divulge everything and give you my full self.
Okay.
So that's typically reserved for like my spouse, Becca, and like 1 or 2 of like my best friends that know that about me,
So all the spaces you just described, the running theme that I think goes through all of them is privacy access, right? And I think that's probably how it would be. I'm assuming, Clint, you're going now to how does that translate digitally?
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. So
Yeah.
And all of this was great because all of the examples were very like in-person types of examples. But now COVID, it's all been blown up. Everything's online now. So how do we make sense of these different discipleship spaces? Are they kind of intermixed? So let's go through some examples. The Sunday morning worship online, the chat room. What is that? Is that a public space still, like we were kind of experiencing in here? Because now, one feature of having a chat is that I can talk to people while the music's playing. You would never do that in person. To start talking like, hey, what are you having for breakfast?
You've never done that before?
Not really, no.
Oh, interesting.
Ask someone what they're having for breakfast next to me worshiping. But in the chat, there seems like the norms have shifted. Brian, have you seen that?
Well, what's interesting, so I think that while we are trying to figure out like what the norms are, so is everybody else. Like no one really knows what the social norms are. Everything from talking through, like chatting through worship, but then you also have some people on Sunday mornings we've seen in the main chat just share some pretty personal stuff. And like and everyone's response has been pretty gracious because I think there's just an understanding of we don't know what we're doing right now, and oh, you shared, awesome, that's really great. Do you want to chat privately in a direct chat? So everyone's just kind of trying to figure that out. And I think that hopefully as a society, like we can get to some norms before this whole season kind of transitions into whatever normal will look like, but it's hard.
And like that sharing thing, the equivalent on a Sunday morning would be like if they had gotten up on the stage with the microphone and just shared some like testimony or personal anecdote.
Yeah.
But because of like the points you mentioned earlier, kind of those barriers are drawn down and they're just sharing to the whole church in a chat room. Really fascinating. Were you going to add something?
Yeah, I mean, the spaces conversation is helpful just for discipleship. I think discipleship does occur in each one of those spaces, but based on kind of those social norms, it looks a little different, right? And I think what we're talking about here is that those kind of social norms right now in the digital discipleship world are just kind of broken broken down. They don't exist anymore. So we were even having a conversation with like Instagram Live. You do an Instagram Live conversation, it's maybe you and one other person having what would be more of a personal or intimate type of conversation, right? Because in a social setting or in the spaces setting, you're in more of that personal or intimate space. But potentially hundreds of people, more in a public space setting, can engage with you in that very personal, or what could be a very personal conversation. And not only are they engaging and listening to it, but they're participating in it. They're giving thoughts and ideas. So
Emojis.
emojis. It's very bizarre right now.
Well, so what's happening there is two spaces are playing out at the exact same time, right? Because you and that one person are having a conversation that's in a more intimate discipleship method, but you have an audience who they're not in that space with you, but they're in their own. So it's two at once, which is crazy.
And I think there's that's part of the opportunity and where we have to be savvy. So I had this happen last week. I happened to be watching, my wife Carissa was doing like a coffee with Carissa Facebook Live, and someone who I was actually kind of surprised to see watching, just normally would be at work, probably not tuning in, made a comment about something being really helpful. And immediately I thought, oh, I'm connected to that person. I wouldn't otherwise, outside of this venue, so to speak, have heard this thing that's going on in their life. I wonder if they would jump more in a one-on-one with me where we could talk about that more in depth. And so I wouldn't have been privy to that information otherwise. I gave the invitation, and 30 minutes later, we were on a Google Meet call talking to each other more in that, really more in that like transforming space, or that
transparent
space,
it was
having a
really
conversation. So all that to say, I think if we're vigilant watching these spaces, it's going to open other doors too.
So I think one of the opportunities is we are able to get more into that personal space setting conversation, or even intimate, transparent space conversation with people quicker than it would happen before, because of, I think, the online, like, those social norms are just, people have no filter. We see this all the time on Facebook, social media. We're seeing it on the Sunday morning chats. Like, people just don't know what's appropriate to share or not to share. I mean, you do get that when you're in person with people in the spaces, but I think it's much fewer and far in between than it is in the online. So I do think in that digital discipleship world, utilizing the spaces or just kind of no spaces whatsoever, I do think the opportunity is that we are able to get there to that more intimate or personal type of space and conversation with people quicker than we have before, which is an opportunity, but also could present some issues as well.
It's kind of funny to me, just as you say that like a thought occurred to me. It's almost like a lot of us are waking up to that reality that this community really can take place digitally. I'm thinking of a neighbor who I know has a friend who they've been friends for a decade now because they've been playing video games online for a decade. And they're good friends. They know details about each other's family. They reach out about birthdays and things like that. And it started online. And so there's a whole community of people who are like, yeah, this stuff happens digitally. But people like me who are stuck in the past are sort of maybe now being forced to recognize, oh my goodness, what a tool, what an opportunity this is.
So what happens next, though, right? So if the goal, the vision is, when do we reopen? When can we start regathering and stuff? I'm curious to find out what this transitions to. Do we jump right back to our old ways? Or how much of the things that we have learned, like the opportunities, do we kind of carry forward to where we have both happening now? And it could be a more holistic approach to discipleship rather than it just being this one method that we know and that we trust.
Boy, if I had to guess, I would say one consequence will be people will be far more conversant and more easily adopt like a Zoom or Google Meet option to meet in the future. Whereas before, that would be like almost like a last case scenario. Like, oh, something crazy came up, I'm gonna have to do Zoom. Like, it's like a fallback plan. Whereas now, I think moving forward, people are like, oh, I have some space on Wednesday morning. You want to hop on Zoom? It's like a more natural choice, maybe. I don't know. Any other thoughts on just armchair prophet? What might happen?
I was hoping Brian, being the expert, would have an answer to his own question. Nope.
I have hopes and dreams. I definitely hope that we can see not just Heartland culture, but just like world culture as a whole, kind of embrace that. what in my lifetime, what I have seen, like big moments in history, like 9/11, for example, right? There was probably a year and a half where the country felt different, but then after a while, it kind of just went back to the way it was. And so my fear is that the opportunities that we have found in this time, that in a year we're going to look back and like, oh, that was that one time in history when we all did Zoom calls and stuff. Where I would hope that we could be intentional about, let's keep using some of these tools where it makes sense to keep using them.
I think also I get excited thinking about the future when I think about different groups of people. So there are individuals we know who right now are hopping on and watching Heartland services on Sunday morning from places that are not in Ohio. Mm-hmm. And what I love is, since e-groups are our option right now, where we normally might say, head out to the Get Connected wall and join a group, and that person's like, well, okay, like, no, they've got an equal opportunity to hop into an e-group and participate together. And so not just for Heartland, but I think for the church in general, I'd love it if we saw churches leaning into that a little bit more, where that person who, for whatever reason, has not found a local church, which in my opinion, which I still think is best, but if they have not done that, maybe they do take the second option and get involved in some kind of community.
Yeah, so we can't abandon like what we're doing right now. It's like the bad missionary kind of concept, right? We can't just go in for 2 weeks, like go to this unreached people group, like present Jesus, get people saved, then like, all right, guys, peace out. I'm heading back home with no follow-up, nothing for them to kind of engage with. So like we have to be very strategic about how we not pull out, but transition back. Like we have to make sure that we set up something that is sustainable digitally for those people that have tuned in, either through the Facebook Lives or the Sunday morning services, where they're hearing this for the first time and they're engaging, and we can't all of a sudden just be gone. And
to some degree, that's probably going to involve social media, whether we like it or not, whatever you happen to think about it. We've brought it up already. What are some of the dangers, challenges, concerns with social media? What are some, like, let's do a little quick pros and cons of social media interaction. If that's where a lot of this is going to take place, what have you experienced so far? And
I'll give it a super quick one. So I'm a fast reader and a quick processor. Social media-wise, I can take in a ton of information very quickly. Even a sermon. I might read a 20-minute sermon in 7 minutes because I'm a fast reader.
What a legend.
But not a legend, but there's a processing that takes place as I listen to that pastor pause, and where that pastor gets serious, and where they say, I think this is really for us. And I just read it, and the way I've been taught to read things, like going to school, is I evaluate this. I kind of give it a grade. And to some degree, that attitude of how I interact with that kind of content, oh, I like his tweets, I'm going to read more of them, isn't always the most helpful for what might the Holy Spirit want to do in this if I give some space to process.
wow.
That's good. Some of us aren't as intelligent as Drew and don't process things as quickly, and but so hypothetically that would be me.
Okay. If
but,
you were that way,
yeah.
how would that person?
If I was that way, not as quick of a processor, how I would approach. Well, I'm not super big on social media. Like I engage in Instagram. Just slowly start to re-engage in Facebook. Facebook drives me crazy, if I'm being honest.
Did you have like 94 friend requests when you first logged in after 2 years?
I don't even think I have 94 friends.
It's
so
up at the top
fine.
with the little red.
I'm now in public space on my friends, so I've reached
My
out.
request is still pending. So
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I think we can't, and this for me too. I don't think we can ignore social media anymore. I think one of the things as followers of Jesus, as disciples of Jesus, that we're participating in is God's plan of redemption for the world. And I think that's all parts and facets of the world, including social media. So I think one of the opportunities that we've seen is like the online stuff, the digital discipleship, the social media stuff's not going away. And so we're either in this place where we have an option. We can stay away from it, go back to just in person, or we can fully press in with that opportunity and step into whatever that plan of redemption looks like in the social media space. What does it look like for us to not just engage in comments and conversations on social media, but bring that intentionality. How am I using my words that I'm typing or entering into the social media space, or these pictures that I'm posting to disciple other people? Like, what does that look like in this space?
Do you have an answer to that?
I do
don't
not
know.
have an answer. Again, hypothetical. I haven't processed it that quick enough yet, Clint, for me to have an answer to it. Maybe Drew, because he's a quick processor, may have an answer.
Well,
but,
no, you
but
had
yeah.
mentioned, Drew, beforehand, this phrase, like how the medium is part of the message.
Yes.
And I'd love for you to wax on that for a moment.
Yeah. It's easier in my head than out loud. But there's a sense of like when you make a statement, the way you make the statement makes a huge, huge difference. I mean, even in a simple lens, you could yell a statement, you could whisper that same statement, and you could talk it through like this, and that will impact how it's heard. That's a very simple way of putting that. But likewise, I think that as we make a Facebook post, as we make a tweet, as we record a video, there are subconscious ways. I sound really pretentious, but there are subconscious ways that our brain starts to interpret that. So honestly, watching video, probably the easiest example. When I go, 20 years ago, and I basically watch video on TV and at the movie theater. And so it is entertainment. That's usually the criteria at that point in my life. Now we've seen video really expand. And so there's different ways. We do podcasts like this that you can watch via video. We do sermons that are now live streamed via video. So when I sit down on the couch and I watch that live stream service, I also bring with me, this is where I sit and watch Lord of the Rings. This is where I sit and watch sports. I can also have my phone out because there's no one watching me. And so all those pieces of the medium, of how I take in that media, do have an impact on how I listen. And so I don't know if I have it all figured out exactly what that means for us, but we do need to be cognizant of the ways that we're conveying what we're conveying impact our listener and impact how it will be heard.
Well, one interesting feature of Facebook, Brian, correct me if I'm totally wrong on the mechanics of this, but if I were to say something, particularly like right now or in the lobby, my listener has a context for like, who else has heard this? So right now when I say stuff, it's the other three of you and Tony, who's doing the soundboard, who can hear my words. But if you post something on Facebook, who knows who saw that? There's this mysterious algorithm. Was that akin to someone just shouting on the streets and the whole world is hearing it? Is it just their entire friends list or just a collection of them? A lot of that context is missing too. I think that's part of like the medium. How does that impact the message? Yeah.
Well, I would even say I think that gets back to that redemption piece of like, how are we using those words or the context of what we're saying? Because anything that's online, out in social media, we can't retract that.
Yeah.
You can give like an apology statement, but that original thing's still out there. Even if you delete it, somebody probably took a
Copy and pasted it.
screenshot of it. It's out there. And so I think that poses an opportunity for each of us in that discipleship because, what space does that fall in? I don't necessarily know, but I do think it's an opportunity for us to think about how we're acting as disciples, as apprentices of Jesus, but also in those people that we're discipling. Like, how are we discipling them to disciple others in an online social media age? And what does that look like, right?
I think really quick, even like that's where some of the creativity comes in. So I love it when I see occasionally a Twitter account of maybe someone who has a ton of followers and they tweet a lot. And then something like Good Friday comes along. And the statement they make using that medium is for Good Friday, they don't tweet because there's something going on. And so actually their lack of noise points their followers to a louder statement of, oh my word, something is happening today that matters. And so I almost think that's even part of it. It's mastering these new mediums. Or one last thought is like using where you would normally advertise, like your business or your brand, to instead tell stories about incredible things that like people are doing, in our case, maybe to share the love of Jesus, whether they're affiliated with Heartland or not.
Yeah, I think those are all really good, like positive, like here are the opportunities. The hazards, the landmines is, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, Drew, of like you're engaging with this content in the same place where you're engaging with movies or sports that you watch, that it could have the negative effect where it reinforces that consumer mentality of discipleship or church or Christianity. And that's hard. Like, so even though social media at its core is a platform that is meant to be interactive, most people are not. They will just sit and they'll scroll for hours, never commenting and just kind of consuming that. And so I have found, like, even in my role here at Heartland, is trying to be creative in how do we create a platform socially where we can give opportunities for people to engage and to interact with us and not just sit back and like take everything in. All right, awesome. I got my 20 minutes of Jesus time in, closing my laptop, and now I'm turning my video game console on. So that's the tricky part, but that's always been there. It's just everyone's focusing on that right now.
So as we're wrapping up, can we give people like some practical next steps, or Brian, like what are some ways to avoid that consumeristic mindset, and how do we disciple well digitally?
I think so social media is a fantastic like launching point, right? We've talked about that, all different ways that we can present content. I would highly recommend that you still reach out personally and make a phone call to somebody on a regular basis. Like have your core people that you're in that smaller circle with, where it's still digital, right? It's still discipleship, but it is on a more intimate level with less distractions. Like build in that rhythm in your life where you have those touch points, whether it's a Zoom call or a phone conversation.
Yeah, one of my tips, I guess, would be just taking hold of your schedule. I think that's a tip always, but everyone's schedule is kind of in flux right now. And so as it pertains to some of these digital pieces, how am I interacting with what and when? And knowing that everyone's kind of going through this schedule reset, and to Brian's point about the phone calls, I think that's what opens up things like both sides of my family have had like family Zoom calls during this pandemic, and we don't do that. And those are just two examples, but there are opportunities to be had should we just look at what are we doing and kind of take control almost of that. I think is a great place to start. Don't find yourself wasting your time in the uncertainty of right now, but bring some intentionality to it.
And I would say I just feel encouraged that discipleship can happen. It does happen in this digital discipleship.
It's not
online.
like we paused the discipleship.
Like it still happens. It looks different. I think we're still figuring it out, and I would love to have future conversations or hear from people, particularly in that REI, like that experience piece. What does that look like? But one of the things that I'm finding is a little bit of both of you are saying, but particularly with that schedule, still like being diligent and intentional and consistent in those relationships. And so there's guys right now that I'm discipling that live kind of all over the country. And so we found a time on Wednesday nights that we chime in on Zoom together and we do a little Bible study. It's a time that we're discipling, but there's intentionality to it. There's consistency to it, just like I would have with any discipling relationship or group of people that I'm discipling, where I may say, hey, 8 a.m. at Starbucks, let's get there. Here's what we're going to be going through. Well, we can't go to Starbucks right now. So like, let's do that over Zoom. So I think some of those principles are the same. Again, like the mission's the same, but I think the method just looks different now.
Well, that's super helpful, guys. I hope you enjoyed that discussion about digital discipleship. Tune in next week. Be sure to like and subscribe. And on our website, you can put in your email address, and then you'll be put on a listserv for updates of when the next episode drops. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.